Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property.
So, Stu, Conveyancing Matters news summer 2025 already. Can you believe that we're at the end of summer?
We say this every single intro, though, don't we? The year just rumbles on, things go so quickly, and before you know it, we'll be talking about Christmas.
I know, I know. Well, we nearly are. Save the date. So for our
I
lovely,
know.
our lovely viewers, save the date, 26th of November, 2025. Drinks on us in London, Stu, at the Wood in Shades.
That's it. Yeah, so we've got our next sort of live networking date, haven't we? In London, where we'll be having a few drinks and talking about sort of topical conveyancing chat.
Absolutely. So everyone put that in your diary, 6 to 9 p.m, 26th of November. And Stu, before we move on to things affecting conveyancers in the coalface, you've been quoted in the Telegraph, mate.
Well, I'm quoted in multiple newspapers all the time, Lorraine. You should know that by now.
Exactly.
No,
What
it was
one?
just a small article where we were quoted on acting with some expats and tax implications and stuff like that. So yeah.
Oh, excellent. Well, good for you. Profile is all really. So anyway, yeah. So our conveyancing matters news. So what's been happening for coalface conveyancers that we need to know about over the last 3 or 4 months? And it's probably worth just pointing out, Stu, I think it's always clear to you and I, but that actually our news section sort of it's talking about things that are in force that are affecting conveyancers today. So not sort of speculation, not more general sort of conveyancing chit chat, but things that conveyancers need to know about, look up, consider that actually is going to affect their job today. And I always think that's quite important to make that clear, so that people know that we're not just talking about things that perhaps might not affect.
Of course, that we're all really busy, aren't we? So it's not what might happen and that sort of thing, not what are, rumors. It's actually what's happening and what's going to affect you in the future.
Yeah. So what the Land Registry has done to think about the first one of these, they've actually put out couple of useful blog posts actually on registering an easement. And I'm quite shocked to see that the Land Registry is sort of suggesting that it's going to sort of, well, to put it bluntly, dumb down its language so that more of us can understand what they're talking about. But easements are really important legal rights that we as property lawyers have to get right. If our client wants a right of way over neighbouring land or a right to use pipes or drain septic tank pipes or whatever, they've got to have a legal easement to enable them to do so. And of course, the Land Reg have got Practice Guide 62 on easements. But I've noticed, Stu, the Land Registry is sort of putting more sort of generic content out there to help conveyancers. And they have put a blog post out there entitled Explaining Easements, Making the Correct Applications. Because, of course, creating the easement by deed is one thing, but of course, you've got to perfect it by registration. And what the Land Registry have said, in terms of an important reminder, Stu, to conveyancers, is whether your application involves a transfer or a lease, it is essential that you apply against every additional title affected by the easement. If an application has not been made against the additional titles and if everything else is in order, we may simply complete the application as specified, which will include only registering the easement against the servient land that has been stated. And I think that's just an important point. The Land Registry are not going to do our jobs for us, particularly when it comes to making the correct applications. And the Land Reg remind us, easements, they interestingly say are likely to remain a complex area of land law. Well, yes, they are. But ensuring you make the correct application should avoid many of the most serious difficulties. And actually, that they've also done a blog post, Stu, that conveyancers might want to look at on how caseworkers investigate easements. So how did the Land Registry sort of look at considering an application to register an easement? And they talk about, of course, an easement should be defined by reference to a plan. So they look for that first. And interestingly, the Land Registry say, we regularly receive applications accompanied by plans that are not clear at all. For example, the colours are difficult to see and or do not follow the underlying map detail. And they say basic things to us like making sure plans are copied in full colour, making sure they're signed by the grantor. So, very basic things, I would say, really. But if you need to register an easement that's benefiting your client's property, if you don't register it properly, you're going to have fallen at the last hurdle. So that's something practitioners might want to look at. I'm moving on, Stu, a topic that's always very close to your heart in terms of money. I'm sure most conveyancers are aware. The Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance on compliance with the Money Laundering Regulations 2017 has been updated. They actually updated and published it on the 23rd of April this year. Really, it's required reading, of course, for all money laundering reporting officers, firm leaders, etc. But really, I think anybody that's involved with AML responsibilities should have a good idea of what it says. And they have made some notable changes, for example, to paragraph 4.7 relating to the economic crime levy, to paragraph 5.6.2.1, excuse me, Stu, dealing with the new definition of high-risk third countries. And, firms need to be up to date with those high-risk jurisdiction lists. And also there is a very useful update, which I know is a challenge for conveyancers too. They've updated paragraph 6.14.4 regarding verifying non-natural persons. But something in particular, Stu, that I think you're always very keen on and making sure your staff are, Stu, is they've sort of fleshed out a little bit more on that good old chestnut for conveyancers, the third party contribution towards the purchase price. What we've certainly done a subscriber video, haven't we? CPD video on the bank of mum and dad, Stu. But what of the LSG?
Yeah, well, look, Lorraine, you mention it all the time, don't you? You say that you assume that everybody would know this kind of thing, but of course, the mere fact that this is published in the first place indicates that not all law firms are maybe as due diligent on the subject of third-party funds as potentially they should be. So, it's becoming more and more complex, I think, anyway, isn't it? The checks that we have to do as a generalization, but particularly identifying when there's a third party and actually making sure that the checks we do on that third party are, completely equal to the checks we would do on our client is absolutely paramount. And I think, yeah, there may be a misunderstanding that the checks are, slightly watered down, dare I say, because it's not the client.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
it is really important. And of course, we talk about source of funds and source of wealth, and it's really understanding that distinction and the difference between the two checks that you're doing. I think that's what they're trying to really get down to.
Yeah, and if any conveyancer is interested, by all means have a look in the LSAG guidance. It's actually at paragraph 617.2.1. And the LSAG say about where we have got, contribution towards a purchase from a third party. They say, and I quote, "You should consider also seeking to understand and obtain evidence relating to the third party's underlying source of funds in the same way you would on the client themselves." And that's the key point that you've just made there, Stu, isn't it? It's
Absolutely.
all based on a risk assessment and the risk profile relating to the client, but also the LSAG go on to remind firms that, and I quote, "You must also bear in mind your obligation to demonstrate the measures you've taken to carry out due diligence are appropriate." The LSAG guidance, Stu, refers to firms' practice-wide risk assessments, but you do see pretty regularly reported in other sort of legal media that firms either don't have practice-wide risk assessments or they don't have appropriate, AML policies and procedures in place. So this is really, really important guidance. And I thought what was interesting, Stu, and again, very interesting for you as a CLC regulated firm, is that actually the CLC has issued an AML alert, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, just to quickly go back to one of your points there, I think everybody should really have a copy of your practices, AML policies and procedures anyway. I would have thought that's quite basic. The expectation levels of your firm, you should know inside out. And, details of the money laundering officer, what they would do, what they would expect of you is really, really, really important. And that just flows straight into, doesn't it? What the CLC have done with their AML alert. And something which I think is difficult sometimes to get your head around because we're often looking for that magic piece of paper which vindicates us from having to look any further into a particular person and how they've got their money. And I'm sure everybody would agree that there's nothing more satisfying that when you launch into your AML checks to see that somebody's sold an asset and they've got that lovely piece of paper that says that they received £100,000 from that asset, and you can kind of tick those boxes off. But where it becomes really, really difficult, as the CLC have indicated, is where, you haven't got that magic piece of paper. And we talk about sort of profiling clients, collecting bank statements over a period of time. And I think it'd be fair to say that everyone does have a different process, does have a different opinion on that. But the CLC have made particular comment on, what you should be investigating, looking at how the money has been potentially saved if you don't have that magic piece of paper. And I would say that this is the most difficult part of, proving a source of funds where it's been saved over a period of time. And you were saying earlier, Lorraine, weren't you, that before we came on air, that people often ask you how many months you should have, how many months of bank statements. And of course, I get asked the same question, and the answer is never 3, 6, 12, 20. You may be able to completely profile a client from 3 months worth. You may not. You may need a hell of a lot more. And it's sort of that client profile, that KYC, that I think is potentially where people, forget in terms of their obligation and what they need to be doing.
Yeah, and what I think is useful, and I say this quite a lot actually, that SRA regulated firms, I think, should be looking at what CLC is putting out and vice versa, because there is just sort of useful guidance from both regulators. Obviously, you'll be judged by what the CLC say and vice versa regarding the SRA, but the CLC have put out this quite useful content on this AML alert. And as you say, they do highlight the sort of, there is no set time frame for which you need to obtain this evidence. But they suggest, and I'm sure firms do this, but recommending that ideally firms have a sort of set of standard questions to ask clients, and they include, this isn't exhaustive, there are plans to say that, but how was the money saved? Please accurately record the source or sources of the savings. Over what period of time was the money saved? And the account details for where the money is held. So really, I would have to say probably the more basic end of the questioning. But until you've got that information, you can't go on to do that more detailed profile. But I think, Stu, that if firms haven't looked at that AML alert, they should. And actually, I was going to mention it later on, but I may as well mention it now because it sort of follows on reasonably neatly. But the Law Society has actually also put out a useful reminder relating to identifying money laundering in the property market. They remind us that conveyancing is one of the highest risk legal services identified by the SRA, and the Law Society has got some case studies that look at some of the money laundering warning signs and cover things like, interestingly, top of their list these days, lack of conveyancing experience, lack of international conveyancing experience, lack of geographic connection, use of agents, rush transaction, the really big chestnuts too, funds being paid into client account before the transactions kind of going anywhere, inflated property value, offer over asking price, third party funds, complex funding, PEPs and vendor fraud. So there's a lot in that Law Society reminder as well. And I think what's interesting is that our regulators and professional bodies, Stu, on sort of both sides of the fence are putting this content out. And of course, as we'll mention, the CLC's 25 risk agenda, of course, also picks up AML as a big risk, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, they wouldn't put this content out if there wasn't a problem, would they? So we'd all need to sort of, know what our obligations are.
Yeah, well, moving on then, Stu, the Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance has also put out, and I'll just direct people to it, an advisory note, again, linked to what we're saying here on the old due diligence, on identification and verification. So they've got an advisory note that contains some actually very useful guidance on alternatives to face-to-face documentary verification. And they point out that, digital ID and verification services can be useful. You need to sort of be linking all of the information that you're giving, maybe verifying phone numbers and emails and so on by sending, codes to clients' addresses to validate access to accounts, using live or recorded digital video. I know that you do that. But what the LSAG sort of go on to remind us, though, is that no matter what identification and verification service or procedure is used, it's still up to the firm and the practitioner to make sure it's correctly used and that you understand what that product is doing for you. And ultimately, Stu, it doesn't sort of absolve the coal-faced conveyancer from any responsibility.
You know what's really interesting about some of that terminology you just used there? It's understanding what the product does. And quite often when I give AML training to some of the newbies that join the firm, you've got to really hammer home, why you're doing this or why you're using that platform. These platforms aid what you're doing. They don't necessarily make the decision, they help you come to a conclusion. And it's understanding, why do I need to see facial recognition? What's the difference between seeing facial recognition or somebody standing in front of you? It's why you're doing it, which is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, moving on, we mention sort of significant cases, Court of Appeal, Supreme Court, always worth mentioning. Just for conveyancers to note, a recent Court of Appeal case, White and Alder, and they heard an appeal basically on whether a boundary agreement, which of course some people enter into, binds successors in title. Obviously, there was a boundary dispute. There was a boundary agreement in place, and the bottom line is that after much toing and froing, the Court of Appeal held, perhaps quite sensibly, that the boundary agreement did bind a successor in title, so a subsequent owner, even if they didn't have any knowledge of it. So, I think probably the more general point for us to tease out of that, Stu, is just the great care that coal-faced non-contentious conveyancers have to take in relation to sort of boundary problems. And if you ever get a whiff of a boundary problem, that's suddenly potentially litigation, and really something that I think conveyancers should be steering well clear of.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more.
And if you don't get that right, of course, Stu, segueing into the next point, that could lead to a complaint. And
absolutely, and our good old friends at Leo,
good old legal ombudsman. So what have they got to
our
say?
good old friends there. So we've had more information released from Leo about sort of third-party delays and maybe how we should be dealing with those. And of course, we've discussed before many a time on this platform how many parties now are subject to a conveyancing transaction. There's so many, the obvious ones, obviously, the obvious one's the land registry. But there are so many people, from management companies to landlords, lots of people chip in, and ultimately, it could be that they cause delay, which leads to a client having an unhappy experience that leads to complaints. And Leo have basically advised what we should be doing as lawyers in terms of communication with clients, regularly updating as to what's happening and chasing that third party.
Is that really practical?
No. And there is some irony when also the legal, ombudsman actually has delays himself, but that might be another conversation for another day.
Yeah. So Leo is suggesting that land registry is the most obvious one, with the land registry's own very well documented delays. They are suggesting that, for example, perhaps after completion, there's a delay with the land registry, that a firm effectively chases that organisation for sort of updates to keep the client informed as to the delay, even when it's a delay caused by a third-party organisation. They are suggesting that firms now add an additional layer of, frankly, probably pointless chasing.
Well, let's face it, you're not going to get an answer to those chases that's substantive to appease a client anyway, are we?
No.
Let's be, I think most firms, or I make the assumption that most firms would have some kind of information within their sort of GUMP, maybe at the start and at the end, to detail the fact that the land registry have these delays, as no doubt that is probably the biggest body that we deal with that do have them. So again, I assume people are detailing that to a client, which I think is really important, because they could be flipping the property, they might be refinancing it, there could be hidden information that you don't know about that is pendant on the land registry concluding the registration. So I think it's really important to mention it in there. But as you say, if you chase the land registry, are you going to get something substantive that you can report back to your client? I very much doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Leo does say this may not be appropriate in all circumstances, but I just think that's potentially just adding an additional layer of sort of admin on the firm, already hard-pressed firm, sort of for its own sake, really. But and speaking of additional pressures on firms for its own sake, you know, I'm very clear about my views on advising clients on climate change, which seem to be fairly different to the law societies. I just point practitioners to the fact that the Law Society in May of this year issued its practice note on climate change and property. What was interesting, Stu, they issued it in May, but then updated it in June with a technical note, can you believe? I think it's a real danger area for law firms, but what the practice note does contain is a checklist summarising what solicitors should consider doing about climate risk in property transactions. It does contain sample wording to go in your reports on title, and it also does contain sort of issues to consider when acting for clients in different types of transactions, be it resi, commercial, and so on. So even if you're very pro climate change and giving that advice, and some firms are, and then they've got appropriate specialists in house, that's great. I think, but even if you're very against giving any sort of commentary on climate change impact on property, you should certainly still at least be looking at the practice note and deciding how you sort of scope your reports accordingly, really. So if you are sort of SRA regulated, I don't think you can afford to ignore the advice, but considering it is I think quite important. So it's just there, really. But what I had a surprising little case, which I thought I would mention, JV Homes and Fincham, involving a construction dispute in Norwich, not a million miles from me. And I just thought conveyancers and frankly all lawyers should be slightly concerned to note that the Technology and Construction Court, so a division of the High Court, essentially has held that an exchange of WhatsApp messages is capable of forming a contract. Needless to say, I mean, obviously the judgment, Stu, goes into the sort of interactions between the two parties, but inevitably they came to blows. They didn't agree. There was a construction dispute between a developer and a contractor. There were various emails and WhatsApp exchanges. One of the WhatsApp exchanges was, "Are we saying it's my job, mate, so I can start getting organised, mate?" Sounds like you and me. The other party said, replied to that WhatsApp message and said yes. And bottom line was that the defendant's case was that the contract was concluded by the exchange of WhatsApp messages, and the court held, if anybody's interested, at paragraph 81, "In my judgment, the exchange of WhatsApp messages, whilst informal, evidenced and constituted a concluded contract." Something that I found quite perfectly arguable, but I think quite scary for lawyers and their clients.
I think again, use that word informal is what's so dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, using a text or WhatsApp exchange to define a contractual relationship. Goodness me.
I think it was sort of fairly significant chunks of money. I mean, it was over 200k. So we weren't talking peanuts by any means, Stu. But anyway, so where do you want to go next?
So we could go back onto our friends at the Land Registry. Okay, and the Practice Guide 50. There's a number of changes. Again, we're talking requisitions, cancellations, and basically how to avoid them, I think, is the main part of that. I think, you know, we can talk about the Land Registry all day long, can't we? And again, the difficulties that law firms are having, but making sure that, you know, you can avoid requisitions is one thing that you can do to try and mitigate these delays.
Yeah, absolutely. And practitioners should just note that Practice Guide 50, as you say, Stu, has been updated in quite a few areas to try to give conveyancers more support, as you say, to help and also avoiding requisitions, but also making applications for extensions of time, which of course has been a big thing in recent months and years because of the Land Registry delays. You know, it's increasingly the case that practitioners are sort of expediting applications, and it is therefore really important that practitioners are following the correct procedures. So I guess if you haven't looked at Practice Guide 50 anytime recently, then you should be really. Well, kind of really to finish, Stu, we mentioned it already, but the probably fairly required reading again, the CLC risk agenda.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we've got our sort of key themes, haven't we? That we almost we talked about some of these today, really, with regards to sort of the land registry. But we've got professional ethics, complaint handling, title change applications, IT resilience, AML sanctions, compliance with the accounts load, conflict of interests, breach of undertaking, and file storage closing practice. So, we've kind of skirted around some of these today, just in our news. So it just shows you how important these subject matters are.
Yeah, and I think what is very interesting is that pretty much almost at the top of its list in the CLC's risk agenda, and the CLC say, and let me just quote directly, while there may be delays at HMLR, these are made worse by slow or sloppy title change applications from conveyancers. And the CLC goes on to say the HMLR data on requisition rates gives cause for concern that some practices are not taking their responsibility seriously, or, and we've touched on this as well, are using HMLR to check their work rather than making an effort to ensure that it's accurate to begin with. And the CLC, and I quote, say, we're also aware of a CLC practice that was removed from a leading lenders panel last year because it failed to improve its performance around requisitions, despite being given several opportunities. So the CLC has definitely put this issue and basically dealing with the land registry applications, as we constantly say, Stu, that's the making sure you can register your client's title is pretty much the most central part of the responsibility of the the land registry, and this is actually and this is a point I've made for years, to be honest. I'm not saying aren't I clever, but the CLC have said that these issues can be a particular problem in firms that have dedicated post-completion teams, and where matters fall through the cracks in the handover from the fee earner to the post-completion team. And it's a point I've made for a very long time, that making sure that information flow, if somebody else is picking up that file, is properly dealt with. But what I just thought was really interesting, Stu, is that the CLC put this as sort of pretty much second in terms of importance
in the risk agenda. Yeah, absolutely.
So again, all CLC practices should have a look at that. But as ever, I think some SRA practices could probably also be well advised to look at the same. So they're the things that have happened that we think are particularly relevant to coalface conveyances in the last few months. And we will obviously do our sort of autumn chat, our autumn news a bit later in the year, Stu. But maybe the Renters' Rights Bill will have moved on by then, along with good old Building Safety Act and other sort of cases and issues. So for the time being, Stu, I think that wraps up our summer 2025 news. And thanks everybody for watching.
Take care, guys.
Take care.